Abigaël Candelas de Ossa, a visiting assistant professor in the Linguistics department and the director of the Sociolinguistics Lab, where members work on language and identity, forensic linguistics, which I find a very intriguing concept I'm curious to find out more about, multilingualism, and pragmatics. Abigail works on how language is used to construct sexual violence and bias-motivated violence and the identities of people who are affected by them. More recently, she's also been working on the representations of bias-motivated crimes and the representation of queer Latinx identities in U.S. media. Originally from the U.S. and Central America, Abigail studied in the U.K. and completed her doctoral dissertation at Queen Mary University of London. Before joining UB, Abigail was a visiting scholar at Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand and at York University in Toronto, truly international, which I find fascinating. And she says it's good to be home. So please join me in welcoming Abigaël Candelas to the Gender Institute.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to come and speak to you. So please do feel free to stop me at any point. So I welcome feedback and discussion. This is very much work in progress. So today I want to talk about multiply marginalized survivors of sexual violence and support resources for multiply marginalized survivors. I'm going to talk about the challenges that multiply marginalized survivors face in seeking redress through the legal system as well as out with the legal system, and how multiply marginalized populations are represented in guidance for survivors of domestic and sexual abuse, and how even well-intended support resources and support organizations may be unintentionally contributing to some of those challenges. And finally, I'm going to suggest some ways that the tools of linguistics analysis can help address these problems. So before I dive in, I want to address the question that I get asked the most about my work, which is why I'm doing it. And specifically, why I choose to look at these questions through the lens of linguistics. So the first part of that question is easier to answer in some sense. So I spent the first part of my childhood in Texas with a family from Central America, and I was born during the Civil War in El Salvador. So into a community that was disproportionately affected by sexual violence. So indigenous women have, for generations, for hundreds of years, been disproportionately affected by sexual violence. So I grew up hearing the stories of the narratives of indigenous women's resistance to sexual violence and gender oppression more broadly. When I then moved to the UK in childhood, the discourse that I heard about sexuality and women's autonomy were very different. And primarily the discourse that I heard the most was that sex was something that good girls just didn't do. Consensual sex was talked about very differently in the UK from those narratives of a very vibrant indigenous women's movement. So I approach my work on British institutions and their discourses about sexual consent, both from an insider and an outsider perspective, right? As someone who's been to school in the United Kingdom, but also as someone who came to those discourses, a little bit later in life. I choose to use the lens of linguistics analysis because as a sociolinguist, I'm committed to the premise that we need to understand the linguistic system to understand the social world. And that the inverse is also true, that we need to understand the social world and to understand how language is used. I think language is an important part of the way that we construct our social reality. So I'm going to talk about some of the insights that using a linguistic perspective can give us and how that can be applied to some of the practical applications that can have. So my work asks, how do texts that aim to support survivors define sexual consent and sexual violence? And how do they construct the implied or the imagined reader and their communities? The talk I'm going to give today examines guidance texts that are produced for survivors of domestic abuse by an organisation called Women's Aid. It's an organisation in England and Wales. It's an umbrella organisation comprised of about a little over 200 different organisations that operate locally throughout England and Wales. I'll talk more about the history of the organisation later on. The organisation exists to support survivors and I'm going to explore the discursive practice used by these texts that are used to achieve this aim of supporting survivors. And I'm going to focus particularly on how these texts construct solidarity and distance between the implied reader, the implied author, and a broader imagined community. I'm going to demonstrate that while the texts are exemplary in many respects, they do a lot of things really well. For example, they speak directly to survivors and sympathetically center some survivors' experiences. I'm also going to show that there are some more problematic trends, so even very well-intentioned organizations that exist for the specific purpose of supporting survivors sometimes unintentionally reproduce problematic discourses. I'm going to focus particularly on the use of pronouns in the texts and how these are distributed through the texts and the discourses in which they're used. So I'm going to argue that the texts construct solidarity between the implied author and the implied reader by using the second person pronouns, you, to directly address survivors, and also the first person pronouns. And that's important. The first and second person pronouns construct the implied author and implied reader as coexisting in a community, the same community. But in texts that discuss the experiences of multiply marginalized survivors, for example, being a lesbian or bisexual survivor or from an ethnic minority or faith background, the texts don't use that first person pronoun pattern. And instead, they use second or third person pronouns, so they, even though they're directly talking to survivors. And the texts tend to use exceptionalizing discourses that present intersectionality in what they term a special circumstance. And they advise survivors who experience multiple disadvantage that their communities may reject them for what they term cultural reasons. So while these texts are very well intentioned, they exist for the specific purpose of supporting survivors, they may be unintentionally reproducing discourses that present minority identities as the problem and that further entrench prejudicial attitudes towards multiply marginalized populations that may make it difficult for multiply marginalized populations to access the support and legal resources that they may need. An important part of the context against which I locate my work is the UK austerity agenda, which has disproportionately affected support organizations for survivors of domestic violence, and in particular has disproportionately affected support organizations with an intersectional focus. So it's not just that that the austerity agenda has disproportionately affected organizations that support domestic abuse survivors. The austerity agenda has particularly affected organizations that support, for example, Black women. And even though multiply marginalized populations are disproportionately more likely to experience sexual and domestic violence, there are fewer organizations that specifically support multiply marginalized survivors in the first place. So my research asks, how do these texts that aim to support survivors define sexual consent and sexual violence, and how do they construct the implied reader? So what linguistic practices do they use to construct the implied reader, the implied author, and a broader imagined community? And I'm going to argue that while these texts sympathetically center some survivors' experiences, they also use practices that exceptionalize intersectional experiences. So I'm going to start by briefly talking about how institutions understand sexual and domestic violence and why this is such a problem. So for a really long time, we've had the stereotype of domestic abuse as primarily taking the form of physical abuse. And that is still the model that the legal system tends to use. But research has shown us that that is not necessarily the form that domestic abuse takes. So domestic abuse is hallmarks by what Evan Stark calls coercive control. And coercive control is not necessarily just physical violence, so it may not necessarily involve physical violence at all. So coercive control is a pattern of strategically used tactics of fear and domination. And that can include using systemic or structural privilege, leveraging privilege. That can include non-physical and non-extrinsic means of power and control and abuse. So this might include, for example, this means that a lot of domestic abuse has been historically has been difficult for courts to recognize or to codify. So the legal system has tended to focus on single instances of physical abuse or criminalized conduct. And even though in the UK there's been a move towards legal reform to introduce statutory definitions of coercive control, there's still a challenge in terms of getting the Crown to actually prosecute using that definition. In situations of multiple marginalization, the leveraging of systemic or structural privilege may take the form of, for example, threatening to report someone to immigration authorities, knowing that they have precarious immigration status, for example, and they may be afraid of being deported, or threatening to out someone to an employer if you know that they're afraid of experiencing negative treatment in the workplace. So these sorts of behaviors, which may or may not involve physical violence, but certainly involve power and control. And while legislation in the United Kingdom recognizes submission due to threats of immediate physical violence, it doesn't necessarily recognize these non-physical forms of control. So by looking at discourses of how sexual and domestic violence are represented and defined in support texts, that also tells us who is considered to be entitled to protection by the state. And while the concept of the ideal or sort of pure victim has been heavily critiqued for decades, one of the things I want to suggest is that concept has not entirely disappeared. It's been diversified. So now instead of there being a single ideal, pure stereotype of a victim, maybe now there are many. So my research examines whether these patterns are reproduced not just within the courtroom or not just within the forensic and legal system, but also by other institutions who aim to prevent sexual violence and to support survivors. So in my research, I examine prevention and support texts that are produced by a broad range of British institutions, and these include police forces, local and national government, the National Health Service, and non-governmental organizations, so non-profits, which is what we'll be talking about today. And I explore how understandings of legal concepts like sexual violence can influence the legal sphere and vice versa. So as part of a larger project on sexual consent and sexual violence and guidance for the British public, which I'm writing up as a monograph, so I welcome input and critique and discussion, I compiled a corpus of guidance produced by local and national UK institutions that are produced for a range of target audiences. The whole corpus is about 120,000 words. Today I'm talking about a subcorpus, which is about 40,000 words, and is comprised of the Survivors Handbook, which is produced by Women's Aid for women survivors of domestic violence. The handbook provides extensive practical advice for survivors on a number of practical matters, including separating from an abusive partner, navigating the family court system, supporting your children, and other aspects of being a survivor or dealing with, coping with domestic violence. The organization itself, Women's Aid, emerged in the 1970s as an explicitly feminist organization. As I said, it's an umbrella organization that's comprised of over 200 organizations that operate locally, and they provide, in addition to providing these texts, they also operate refuge accommodation, so they provide a lot of practical support locally, as well as advocacy, so they're very visible on a national level. Okay. I've divided the corpus up, so today I'm just talking about the text for women survivors. I've divided the corpus up according to the target audience because that is how the texts sort of occur in the wild, as it were. While I was collecting them, the texts are always presented as being for a specific target audience. I'm happy to talk more about that. And my focus is on practices of what Fairclough calls synthetic personalization. So these are practices by texts that are mass-produced, but are used to make mass-produced texts seem like they are personal to you.
That's a great phrase.
Yeah, I love it. So these may include a number of different linguistic practices. And today I'm going to talk about pronouns, and these may be used to construct group co-membership or not. But it may also include a range of other linguistic practices, such as presuppositions, so these are backgrounded linguistic assumptions, which may be used to project beliefs and experiences, so a shared history or shared assumptions, questions or instructions or question-answer sequences, which I'll talk about a little bit. So these construct the implied author as being the more knowledgeable party in a shared mutual rapport, as well as other linguistic practices. And I use corpus-based critical discourse analysis. So I'm going to talk mostly about the qualitative analysis today, but I'm happy to talk about the quantitative analysis as well. So in order to look systematically at, essentially, corpus analysis is useful to be able to look at large amounts of text, large amounts of data in a systematic way, and to be able to systematically study patterns that may be below the level of conscious awareness, so maybe influencing you on a subconscious level, but may occur too infrequently or maybe too low salience for a human analyst to be able to look at manually. So that's why I combine both critical discourse analysis and corpus analysis to be able to get the best of both. In particular, I used the quantitative analysis for looking specifically at pronouns to see if the trends were systematic in terms of who the pronouns were used to address. So from this subcorpus of 40,000 words, I extracted 1,767 pronouns and manually annotated them to see who they were referring to. Goodness. So whether referring to survivors, whether referring to survivors' family members, like their children, whether referring to abusers, other supportive community, or someone else. And then I look at how the pronouns are distributed. So are they distributed evenly through the text? Do they only occur in certain sections of the text? And what words do they co-occur with? So what I want to know is, who is being addressed with which pronouns? And how do they co-occur within certain kinds of discourses? One of the positive patterns that I found in these texts is that they do use this coercive control notion of domestic abuse. So when they're defining domestic violence, they say there are a number of different definitions. These are extracted from the text. There are a number of different definitions of domestic violence. In the organization's view, domestic violence is physical, psychological, sexual, or financial violence that takes place within an intimate or family-type relationship and forms a pattern of coercive and controlling behavior. So this definition very explicitly talks about this coercive and controlling pattern. It doesn't necessarily suggest that physical violence is the only or even the primary component. In the second extract, sexual violence is defined as using force, threats, or intimidation to make you perform sexual acts. So again, this definition does not necessarily suggest that force is the only or the primary or even necessarily a component at all. When we looked at how the pronouns are distributed in these discourses, what I found was that first-person pronouns, so second-person pronouns are fairly evenly distributed through the text. So throughout the text, survivors tend to be addressed as you. But first-person pronouns are primarily used to project beliefs and experiences onto survivors and to their supportive community. And in particular, they're used to position survivors and people who support them for sympathetic critique. So they're used to position people in a sympathetic way and to offer advice. So an example of this is in number 3. What is a refuge and how can I stay in one? In this example, the survivor is positioned as being agentive and active in resisting and coping with abuse and in trying to escape an abusive situation. And they're referred to using the first-person pronoun. This occurs within a question-answer sequence. So after this question, the text gives practical advice about how that person can leave that abusive situation and obtain alternative accommodation. Now, that first-person pronoun actually occurs quite infrequently. The second and third-person pronouns are much more frequent. An example of the third-person usage is in example 4. Women stay with their abusers because they still love them. Now here, both the survivor and the abuser are referred to using that third-person pronoun. Even though the texts are directly addressing survivors, the texts are still using that third-person pronoun. for someone they're directly talking to. And that suggests a little bit more distance. Right now, we're not constructing survivors as belonging to the same community. What I found was that there was a difference in the distribution of the first and third person pronouns, depending on whether or not the texts were talking about leaving an abuser versus being in a continuing relationship. So if the texts were talking about leaving an abuser, they're much more likely to use the first person pronoun. Whereas if you're talking about staying in quote, staying with an abuser or being in a continuing relationship with an abusive person, they're much more likely to use the third person pronoun. And what we know about coercive control is that that is a mechanism that is used to keep women in abusive relationships. And so while, of course, it is hard to leave and we want to support people to be able to separate, we also know that that's a long-term process. And if women feel that they are judged when they are trying to leave or when they're unable to leave because they're experiencing that coercive control, they're less likely to reach out for support. Those patterns in terms of the dispersion of pronouns can be looked at systematically. So these are dispersion plots which show the dispersion of the different pronouns. So the one at the top is the first person pronoun, the second one is the second person pronoun, and the third one is the third person pronoun. So as you can see, the second one and the second person pronoun and the third person pronoun are distributed pretty systematically, right? They occur pretty evenly through the text. The top plot, which shows the first person pronoun, has this big gap in the middle. So basically the dispersion plot just draws a line everywhere that the pronoun occurs. The first plot shows this big gap in the middle where the first person pronoun does not occur. And if I look and see in the corpus why that is occurring, that is due entirely to discussions of multiple marginalization. Okay. Let's skip the numbers. Do people want to talk about the numbers?
Maybe a little bit.
Okay, let's talk about the numbers. Okay, so this is just quantifying that difference in the dispersion. So this dispersion statistic here, this is deviation of proportions. So that is a number between 0 and 1. You can think of it as being kind of like a standard deviation, except it's normed, so it occurs between 0 and 1. And a number closer to 0 means the number is means that the pronoun is more evenly dispersed. A number closer to 1 means it's more unevenly dispersed, right? So then you're looking at the last two columns. Mm-hmm. So you and they are much more evenly dispersed. And then with I and we, the first person pronouns, they're almost maximally unevenly dispersed. One of the sections of the text is titled Special Circumstances, and that is the section of the text that specifically addresses multiple marginalization. Within that section, it has subsections that address sexuality, disability, immigration status, as well as other aspects of multiple marginalization. I think it's actually quite an interesting choice that they chose to have a specific section that was separated out, titled Special Circumstances. And that in itself suggests that the default, or that they see the default as being, to be heterosexual, to be white, to not have precarious immigration status, to not be disabled, etc. Okay, so an example from this section is example 5. If you are lesbian or bisexual, you may have experienced abuse from another woman, or you may have been abused by a male partner or former partner, or by other family members. If you are from a Black or minority ethnic community, you may, as a lesbian or bisexual woman, face particular hostility due to cultural reasons. So in this example, the marginalization that you may experience as a survivor of sexual violence is positioned as being located within the culture of your marginalized community. And I think tellingly, while most of the text discusses community as a potential source of support, in this section on multiple marginalization, community is positioned as being the locus of marginalization. And I think to some extent that also shifts responsibility from perpetrators to multiply marginalized communities. So now domestic abuse is being conceived of as a problem not with perpetrators, but with multiply marginalized communities. In examples 6 and 7, we also see a shift from the multiply marginalized community to the specific individual who's experiencing the abuse. So in example 6, if you are a Black or minority woman trying to escape from domestic violence, your experiences may be compounded by racism, which is pervasive in the UK. You may be unwilling to seek help from statutory agencies, such as the police, social services, or housing authorities, because you're afraid of a racist response. So while this section of the text acknowledges racism as being pervasive, and it is, it also places the sort of locus of choice, the locus of responsibility, on the individual experiencing the abuse. Right? So the problem is not perceived, is that while racism is acknowledged as a problem, it's conceived as being a choice that the person makes to be concerned about that or not. The same thing with example 7. You may prefer to get support from someone from the same ethnic, religious, or cultural group as yourself. So while racism is conceived of as being a problem, it is not necessarily conceived of as being a problem with support organizations. And so the problem is being the problem is being constructed as a problem with the preferences of the survivor. And so positioning victims' cultural context as the problem shifts that responsibility from the perpetrator onto multiply marginalized communities, and from multiply marginalized communities onto individual victims. Okay. These texts are using a lot of positive strategies, right? They are trying to center the specific experiences of survivors. They are trying to position survivors as agentive, and they are trying to be sympathetic. But they are also reproducing some, unintentionally, but they are reproducing some problematic discourses. Okay, so many of these practices are exemplary, right? They're framing abuse as being hallmarked by coercive control. They're centering survivors' experiences. They're giving a lot of practical suggestions. And they're characterizing survivors as agentive and strategic in how they cope with and resist abuse. But the text can also be strengthened and clarified. So there are lots of ways that we can do this. And linguistics, one of the things that I think is helpful about linguistic analysis, is that it gives us really practical strategies for doing this. So I think one really clear thing to emerge is that it's important to use these practices of synthetic solidarity consistently with all survivors, not just based on your sexual identity or your ethnic identity, but consistently with all survivors. I would also suggest that an important practice is to recenter intersectional experiences. So it is not, I think, adequate to conceptualize intersectional experience in an additive way. So intersectional experience is not adequately conceptualized by saying, well, there's survivors' experiences and then there's also intersectional experience. You need the understanding intersectional experience actually means that we need to revise our understanding of what coercive control is, right? The way that coercive control leverages that structural privilege. I think a third way that these texts can be strengthened and clarified is by focusing on survivors' space for action. So to develop a broader discourse of survivors' agency and space for action. So while we're obviously, anytime we're talking about abuse, we're obviously talking about, your agency being constrained. The ways in which you negotiate that, I think, are important to talk about, because that then gives us a vocabulary for talking about the leveraging of that structural privilege. One of the things I want to suggest, this is a little bit tentative, but one of the things I would like to suggest then is that the ideal victimhood that we've been critiquing for a really long time is actually not completely gone from these texts. It's been, it's just diversified. And so I think to revising our understanding of agency and identity with respect to the ideal victimhood, I think is the kind of the next step in terms of strengthening and clarifying these texts. Thank you.
Thank you.